After publishing Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, Smith became renowned as a man of letters. He came back and started working on the book that would become An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which he published in 1776. One important thing to note is, first of all, the title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. He observes over time that different countries, different societies have larger or smaller degrees of prosperity. And what are the factors that play into that? The 18th century in Europe is one of the solidification and the reinforcement of the movements in the 17th century towards the nation state. And so a big part of the Wealth of Nations is a critique of mercantilism, and particularly mercantilist policies that stifle free trade. Smith's going to make a very strong argument in this book that free trade is what promotes the wealth of nations. Another important aspect of the Wealth of Nations is that it's a very comparative work, and it comes in on the stream that he starts with the Theory of Moral Sentiments. We still have a model and a framework based on self-interested individuals, but Smith does have a very broad concept of self-interest. Smith divides it into 5 books. Book 1 contains many of the foundational ideas of economics, the ideas that we think of when we think about why we consider Adam Smith the father of modern economics. And Book 1 is where he delves into the role that labor plays in making a society productive and economically making it thrive. He starts with the famous example of the division of labor as the source of economic growth. And he dives right in and tells us that in every society that has experienced widespread and universal opulence, that opulence is due at its core to the division of labor. Here he illustrates this with the famous pin factory example, where if you start with a few people working having to do all of the 22, I think it is, steps to make a pin individually, and instead you divide those folks up and have them each do one of the steps, that the productivity of the pins for a given amount of time it increases by more than an order of magnitude. We think of Smith as being very much about competition, and yeah, in markets it's about competition, for sellers to compete to offer a better product at a lower price, or for buyers to compete to offer higher prices to get a very scarce good. But one of the other factors that Smith really points to is that that mutual interest of the buyer and the seller, that there's a mutually incompatible, if you will, interest of the buyer to want to pay as little as possible, the seller to want to get as much as possible out of a transaction, but that they both need each other. Another aspect of markets that Smith explores in great depth in Book 1 is the idea of the natural price. And this is how Smith characterizes the kind of long-term objective foundation that anchors prices in markets, that this sort of long-term price is going to be determined by the wages paid to the workers that produce the good, the rents that the land earns that is used to produce the good, and the profits that accrue to the capital. The dynamics of the interaction of supply and demand over time means that in the long run, as all of those fluctuations play out, that natural price is going to be determined by the minimum wages, rents, and profits that will be paid to the factors of production that bring that commodity into being and to the market. And in the short run, market price will fluctuate and will differ from the natural price. But Smith argues that in markets that don't have entry barriers, exit barriers, excessive regulations, that those market prices will converge back to the natural price. He then goes on in Book 2 to explore capital and economic growth. Capital accumulation is necessary before production occurs in order to keep labor and increase productive labor. Then in Book 4, he dives into the critique of mercantilism and the critique of the physiocrats. He lumps these together because he thinks that both approaches to analyzing economics are non-natural in a sense. In mercantilism, there are two two aspects that he critiques specifically. One is the mercantilist argument that wealth is equal to gold or silver. Smith's critique in The Wealth of Nations builds upon Hume's argument that inflows of specie largely have increased prices as their consequence. And Smith builds on that argument by also critiquing the entry barriers, trade barriers, tariffs, import duties, customs charges, all of the various ways that these nation states following mercantilist policies tried to restrict trade in order to maximize the amount of gold and silver within their borders. So notice here he's also breaking the zero-sum game, you win, I lose belief that undergirds mercantilist economic theory by saying trade is made of win. Trade makes both parties better off. He is putting forward an argument about absolute advantage, not comparative advantage, that the parties that can produce different goods at lower costs should be free to trade. In Book 5, this is where he gives us his ideas about the proper role of the state. He puts them in three categories. The first is defense, national defense, defending the country's borders. The second is the administration of justice. And his argument here builds directly on the moral foundations that he laid in Theory of Moral Sentiments. The final category of the proper role of the state for Smith is what he calls public works. And for Smith, this will be things like bridges and canals and roads. And schools. Education falls under the idea of public works. In all cases, his argument is that the role of public funds, the role of the taxpayer funding, should be the construction, contributing to the construction of the infrastructure. But that users should pay user fees in order to give them the right incentives to induce the proper use and the proper valuation of the presence of that infrastructure. These combined together give us the formal institutions upon which we can build with the underlying moral philosophy he built in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that enable us to live together harmoniously in civil society and to coordinate our actions and behaviors in ways that improve our well-being and in aggregate create economic growth and, in his excellent language, widespread opulence of society.